Welcome back to Good Morning Coda Territory. It's 6:42. Now, for the last 48 years, a murderer has been walking among us in Rapid City, but the suspect is on the brink of being caught. For the next 4 days, I'm diving into how investigators are uncovering the truth in the death of 60-year-old Gwen Miller in 1968. Cold case, murder, a Coda News Extra. Detective Wayne Keefe was just 2 years old when a murder shook Rapid City. A 60-year-old woman raped and murdered, and now, nearly 50 years later, Keefe is determined to put the murderer behind bars.
She was a kind, sweet older lady who kept to herself, didn't bother people.
The year was 1968. A pharmacist at Bennett Clarkson Hospital, which is now Regional West, Gwen Miller, didn't show up for work.
Her coworkers wondered why. She was, I guess, known to be a diabetic, and they were in fear that she might have had a medical issue, and they went to her house to check on her and found that she had actually been murdered.
But the scene here on Hall Street was far from horrific. It looked like Gwen had gone to sleep and never woke up until her coworkers pulled back her bed covers.
The crime scene was well made up. It wasn't torn apart, busted up. It wasn't a bloody mess or anything like that. It was just looked like she had gone to sleep in her bed. Well, once our investigators got there and started looking at it, it became evident that there was more to it than that.
What police found on the victim led them to believe Gwen had been raped and strangled. But why? The question still puzzles investigators to this day.
How she was killed and that she was. I mean, this wasn't a person that dealt and behaved in high-risk manners.
Recent evidence is giving investigators new hope in this case.
Never know what's going to come through that door.
Tomorrow we look at deep inside the crime scene where Gwen was murdered, and now new evidence and technology could identify the killer. Kayla Carvel, Coda Territory News.
Coda Territory 643. Now this week we're reporting on the murder of a 60-year-old Gwen Miller. It happened 48 years ago and in 1968 in Rapid City. Now Miller killed in her bed at home, and now evidence collected 48 years ago being used to find the killer today.
And now a new detective is looking into a new suspect and motives for the violent crime. New technology may be the key to how the killer may finally be revealed. DNA testing wasn't around in 1968, but investigators still took everything they could from Gwen's bedroom where she was murdered.
Evidence on the scene that at the time was collected even without the investigators having any idea that it would be usable 48 years from now to do DNA sampling on. I have had to do a great deal of work on that suspect in particular to locate relatives within the correct family line for me to request that they provide a DNA sample for me.
And that lack of technology may be one of the reasons Gwen's murder was never solved.
40 years ago, we had a totally different system for maintaining custody then. It's nothing like we have now.
Fingerprints were taken at the crime scene. All of those fingerprints belong to Gwen's coworkers who found her body, but one fingerprint is still unaccounted for.
There's probably been 50 people that I've gotten prints on that there were prints taken 40 years ago as elimination prints.
Investigators are now piecing together how the killer got into Gwen's home.
Home itself was broken into. All the information on the case leads me and the investigators back then to believe whoever did this knew her.
What investigators found was a broken window on the back door. Next to the back door, a flower bed with a brick broken in half. The second half of the brick was never recovered.
There was some speculation through the investigators at that time that the window was actually broken from the inside out.
But no one saw anyone break the window. What they did see was a taxi drop off a man in front of Gwen's house that night. Those witnesses were Gwen's neighbors when she was murdered, and 48 years later, they still remember what they saw.
They've had a lot to say. They remember this case even though they were a child when it occurred.
The unidentified fingerprint found at the crime scene was also found in the taxi, which supposedly dropped the suspect off at Gwen's home.
One print was not on the window that was broken, but it was in a different portion of the house where a normal person walking through their house, it shouldn't have been there.
Now investigators are asking, was the mysterious taxi man the killer? We look into how evidence has been maintained after 48 years. Tomorrow on Cold Case, Murder. Kayla Carvel, Coda Territory News.
And investigators say this case has a lot of strong physical evidence, so if the fingerprint is ever identified, putting the killer behind bars should be fairly easy. Eric? In the past 2 days, we've told you about the murder of Gwen Miller in Rapid City in 1968. So Could her killer finally be identified nearly 50 years later? Where our Kayla Corvell joins us this morning from the Rapid City Evidence Building to tell us how the evidence from the case has been maintained for so long.
48 years after Gwen Miller's murder shocked Rapid City, DNA evidence could unveil the killer, but a massive flood in 1972 destroyed some of the documentation that could be used against the suspect in court. We look at how some of the evidence has been maintained over the last 48 years in today's cold case, murder.
In 1972, we had a massive flood here in Rapid City. Most of the police department records prior to 72 were stored in the basement of that building, which was filled completely full of silt and water. As a result of that, I have very limited documentation on what was actually accomplished.
With much of the physical documentation gone and many of the witnesses now dead, Detective Keefe has had a difficult time putting the pieces of Gwen's case together.
I have been able to locate and speak with 4 of the prior investigators that actually worked on that case, that stood on scene, on that homicide scene, and worked it from the very beginning. And that's been a blessing, to be able to gain their insight and talk to them directly what their thoughts were, what they were working on, what they did.
Evidence such as clothing, fingerprints, and the brick from the broken window are still sitting in the Pennington County Evidence Building, and the security surrounding the evidence is tight. So when the suspect is caught, the evidence from 48 years ago will be used to convict him.
The integrity of the evidence is maintained, that we maintain a good chain of custody, so if that evidence ever goes to court, there's no question about if it's been tampered with or anything like that.
And the fingerprints taken from the scene are now being analyzed with new DNA tests, a new technology that wasn't around 48 years ago.
Back then, they were a lot more attuned to fingerprint work, so the crime scene was basically processed primarily, to my understanding, for fingerprint material. We can use that fingerprint material for DNA purposes as well.
Now it's a waiting game.
You know, I've been able to help eliminate certain people from those fingerprints, and we're still just kind of waiting right now in a holding pattern to see what kind of information he can get back from the state health lab or the state forensic lab.
Tomorrow, we find out if Detective Keefe has identified the killer or if he starts back at square one. Reporting live, Kayla Corvell, Coda Territory News.
Coda Territory 642 on this Thursday morning. Now, over the last 3 days, we showed you how Gwen Miller's murder in Rapid City 48 years ago shocked our city, and her killer never identified in the final edition of Cold Case Murder. Kayla Corvell finds out whether Miller can finally rest in peace.
48 years, detectives have been searching and investigating the murder of 60-year-old Gwen Miller, and soon the suspect could be brought to justice.
It's been a challenge on some parts, but actually a blessing on others.
But there's one last problem with a case that took place nearly 50 years ago.
One of the main suspects in that case passed away several years ago. So it's not that I'm going to try and solve this case to bring them to court. That's not an issue anymore. They've passed away. We're working on solving this case for the family members of the victim that still are alive.
And now it's a waiting game. The main suspect, a former pharmacist and co-worker of Gwen when she lived in Nebraska. His family has volunteered their DNA to be compared with the DNA found on Gwen's body when she died.
It's always good to have closure. It's always good that even though we're 40 years removed from the case, that we can provide closure to the case, that it's not sitting open, that we don't have this woman who was, you know, brutally murdered without closure for her family.
And as for the identity of the suspect, the Rapid City community will need to wait just a little bit longer.
I would have hoped to have had it solved by now, but unfortunately, when you're working on something that's 48 years old, it takes a little time.
Any day now, DNA results could come back from the state forensic lab. It could help ID a killer and the cold case would be solved, or it could be a dead end and Keefe's investigation would need to start all over. Kayla Corvell, Coda Territory News.
And we'll continue to follow the story, and when those results come back, we will make sure that we update you on the conclusion of this story. Eric?